I will be the first to tell you that I think it's highly unlikely that the budget could be, now in these new circumstances, could be balanced by 1984, which was our goal. But this is not a case of a broken promise. This is a case of circumstances beyond our control, whose foundation has been laid over the last several decades.
Despite what the president said today, a growing number of politicians believe huge budget deficits are circumstances within his control if he changes his policy. Good evening. President Reagan said today he would not raise taxes to tame the startlingly high budget deficits his administration is now projecting. At today's news conference, the president was repeatedly pressed to explain why he had abandoned campaign promises to balance the budget. The administration's own estimates, leaked recently, put the deficit for the 1982 fiscal year, ending next October, at $109 billion. The deficit for fiscal year 83 at $152 billion. With $162 billion, the figure for 1984, the year for which Mr. Reagan, until recently, was promising a balanced budget. Today, he said that was never a promise, merely a goal, and that he was not going to balance the budget with a punitive tax system that torpedoed the economy. Most commentators believe the administration and the Republican Party now face major political battles to reconcile past dogma that deficits cause inflation with their new line that deficits aren't so bad. Tonight, the president's deficit dilemma. Jim?
Robin, a very large political worm has turned on this business of a balanced budget, and it's given a lot of Democrats here in Washington their first fun in months. Quote, "This has to be the reversal of the decade. This not only walks out on the conservative economic gospel in this country, it leaves the administration standing out there all alone, naked as a jaybird, without a fig leaf of principle to cling to." That from Senator William Proxmire, Democrat of Wisconsin. From Senator Ernest Hollins, Democrat of South Carolina, to his Republican Senate colleagues, your party has a sort of kidney stone you're going to have to pass. Proxmire, Hollins, and others are loving the fact that Republicans for years have been clubbing Democrats as the spendthrifts, whose budget deficits have caused the country's economic problems, most particularly inflation. One of the biggest clubbers of all being none other than Ronald Reagan. Now, as they see it, they've got the club handed to them without a fight by that same Ronald Reagan. A lot of conservative Republicans, particularly in the Senate, see it the same way. But that is not the way the administration sees it, as we're going to find out now from one of the principal architects of the tax portion of the Reagan economic plan, Norman Ture, Undersecretary of the Treasury for Tax and Economic Affairs. Mr. Secretary, has the administration gone through what Republican Senator William Armstrong calls a malevolent metamorphosis on the evils of budget deficits?
I'm all admiration for the metaphors. I think the jargon is marvelous, but I don't think the substance of the observations are correct.
What has happened?
Well, we have, in fact, found ourselves with more of a deficit being generated than we had anticipated earlier this year. But I don't think there's been any shift in the administration's basic program. What the president had focused on and emphasized was getting control of government spending. That, in no way, shape, or form, has been altered as a cornerstone of the administration's policy.
But what about the statements attributed to Mr. Niskanen and others of the Council of Economic Opportunities, Council of Economic Advisors, that the deficits aren't as big a factor in causing inflation as many have believed? Now, that's where the problem has come, has it not?
Well, that certainly generated a lot of interest, particularly among the members of the Fourth Estate. But Niskanen's statement doesn't represent anything new so far as economists who have been looking at fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the sources of inflation for many, many years past. Deficits will generate inflation if the deficits are monetized, and if the increase...
If they're what?
If, in fact, there is an increase in the stock of money to pay for the deficits at a much more rapid rate than otherwise would be warranted. It is the increase in the stock of money that generates the inflation, not the deficit itself.
Well, let's be specific. On these projected deficits that Robin mentioned at the beginning, can the economy absorb those without doing severe damage?
Yes, I think the answer to that is certainly yes. Consider what the alternative would be. The alternative would be to try to reduce those deficits either by further reducing expenditures, something which this administration would heartily endorse and which would be certainly constructive for the economy, or by trying to close the deficit by increasing taxes, which would be counterproductive, enormously counterproductive.
Why would it be counterproductive?
Because it would certainly have an adverse effect on aggregate economic activity, which is the well from which the flow of revenues proceeds.
And that, of course, is the guts of the supply-side economic theory, as it's called, which you
Well,
are...
that is a collateral part of it, certainly. The last thing in the world any of us would want to do, and I'm sure there is perfect unanimity among us on this, would be
We'll find out in a sec.
to take those fiscal measures which would have the effect of discouraging the expansion of economic activity. We have been at pains during this Congress to provide the most constructive, in my judgment, changes in the tax law virtually since we've had an income tax. I think it would be counterproductive at this point to undo any of those or to offset them with other kinds of significant tax increases.
Well, you say the constructive way to go would be to make more budget cuts. Well, the president said in the news conference this afternoon that he did not believe that too many, my interpretation of what he said at least, you correct me if you interpret it differently, that there weren't too many more budget cuts that could be made in domestic spending if the government is going to continue to function and provide services to the people. Is that the administration's position?
I don't believe, no, I think that's a possible construction, but I would interpret his remarks somewhat differently. May I quote, he said the only proper way to balance the budget is through control of government spending and increasing prosperity and productivity for all. The latter is what the tax program has aimed at, and I'm confident it's going to be highly effective to that end. Our tax program, as enacted during this past Congress, I think will provide the institutional environment in which business and households alike will expand their activities very, very substantially. I think we are on the verge of the kind of recovery that we have not seen in ages past. And I would not like to see fiscal policy be responsible for undoing it.
As a key member of the Republican administration, are you uneasy at all about what you said a moment ago, and you and others have said in the past, or I should say in the last couple of weeks, about deficits not being as difficult to handle? Does that make you uneasy?
Jim, let me correct on that. I think that you will find in the record of the Committee on Ways and Means, the Finance Committee, the Budget Committees, and in both houses, that those of the administration who testified to the point that you're now raising always emphasize that the way in which the deficit comes about is enormously important in determining whether or not it will be harmful or not of major consequence for the economy.
So they're good deficits and they're bad deficits?
I wouldn't put it that way. It's not that they're good or bad. There are some deficits that really spell disaster. There are some that are certainly counterproductive. And there are others which are of much less adverse consequence for the economy.
And these fall in that latter category?
Well, to the extent that these deficits are generated by the kinds of tax reductions that we have achieved, I think they are of much less adverse consequence. To the extent that they result from the fact that we have not achieved all the spending control measures that we would like, those are serious. One of the major sources of the deficits that we are now looking at is a significant recession phase that we are in. What that does is lower the base from which future growth will occur. And that means that revenues will not be as large at any future point, even with the same kind of growth rates we anticipated earlier, as we had earlier expected to receive. I don't think anybody would say that the best way to overcome deficits from that sort is by increasing taxes. I certainly hope no one would.
Thank you. Robin?
A number of conservative Republican senators are unhappy about the new deficit figures and administration explanations that deficits aren't so bad after all. One of them is Slade Gorton of Washington State, a freshman member of the Senate Budget Committee. Senator, do you believe that these deficits, in Mr. Ture's words, that the economy can absorb these deficits without damage?
I do not. It may very well be that a deficit will be more inflationary when it is simply covered by an increase in the monetary supply. But if deficits of the level about which we're speaking now are not covered by an increase in the monetary supply. They're simply going to dry up the capital, which needs to be available to fuel an expansion in the economy. Those are the horns of the dilemma on which the administration finds itself at the present time.
Do you say this as a Republican yourself because the new look at deficits violates traditional Republican dogma on which so many of you have campaigned for so long, or because there's an actual flaw in the economic argument as you see it?
Obviously, I can't speak for every Republican, but it has always seemed to me, and was the dogma I preached in my own campaign, that ending the deficit was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. The end was a strong and a growing economy. The end was relatively low interest rates. The end was a lower rate of inflation. If we came up with some magic formula which would provide us with all of those features and a deficit at the same time, we'd accept a deficit. We don't believe that that magic formula has been found.
Now, if you believe the economy cannot absorb these deficits, I know that you and a number of other freshman Republican senators have called on the president to do a number of things, and one of them is to raise revenues through closing some tax loopholes and some other measures. What do you think of Mr. Ture's argument that it would be counterproductive to increase taxes at this time, that it might damage the possibility of recovery?
Just as Mr. Ture finds the source of deficits to have a different impact depending on that source, so we find the source of revenues to have a different impact. We had a balanced program. We are not simply in favor of increasing revenue growth in the country through additional taxes. We do think that there should be further limitations on spending, especially in those areas such as defense and entitlements, which were not touched during 1981. But we do believe that we are not going to get to a point of even significantly lower deficits unless we go back essentially to what the president's original tax cut proposals were. What Congress passed last year, at least in a 5-year period, is close to $200 billion more than the president asked for. We do think that there are loopholes which can be closed without a significantly adverse impact on the economy.
Can you give us a couple of examples of those?
Yes, I think we made a mistake in passing the tax lease portions of the July tax bill. I think there are a number of other areas of the absolute forgiveness of taxes on corporations working in our island possessions and the like that it is necessary to view. I do not believe, however, that we should either reduce or slow down the personal income tax cuts which were passed last July. Those are a key to prosperity in the future.
Looking at the political situation as you and the administration go into January, where this 1983 budget is going to have to be hammered out very quickly, would you say that the administration is going to have to accept some revenue increases, tax increases, and some cuts in defense and entitlements?
I would hope that the administration would listen with some interest, not just to what the freshman Republicans requested, but to what all of the Republicans, or practically all of the Republicans in the Senate, did in passing this year's second budget resolution. And that is to take a balanced approach which includes a reduction in the rate of defense expenditure growth, which includes some very significant producers of revenue. The administration will not succeed if it comes in with a budget which simply cuts the same discretionary programs which suffered almost all of the 1981 cuts.
Thank you, Senator. Jim?
Finally, a Democratic view of the balanced budget dilemma. It comes from the _1 budget man in the House, Congressman James Jones, Democrat of Oklahoma, chairman of the House Budget Committee. Congressman, do you see any inconsistency in what the administration once said about budget deficits and what they're saying now?
Well, I think you see very many. For example, when President Reagan was candidate Reagan in 1980 and before, he consistently said that high interest rates and inflation are caused by the government spending more than it's taking in, that you have to balance the budget. And I can cite numerous magazine articles going back to 1975. In March of this year, the president came before, or April, the president came before Congress and used the word promise to reach a balanced budget by 1984. In September of this year, the president came before the American people and used the word commitment to reach a balanced budget by 1984. So what the administration's advisors are saying in December does not square with what the president said before he came to Washington and earlier this year.
Do you buy the president's and Secretary Ture's explanation of why these deficits have grown?
Well, I don't buy it to the extent that the economy turned sour between September of 1980 and January of 1981. If you look at the record, in almost every respect, the economy was improving from September 1980 to January 1981. If you look at this year, in almost every respect, from January until July, the economy continued to improve. It was only after the entire budget program and tax program actually came on the books in which the economy started to unravel. And if you look from January to December of this year, you see a great decline in economic performance.
Do you believe that these deficits, as anticipated, can be tolerated by the economy? You've heard what the Secretary has said and now what Senator Gorton has said.
Well, I don't. My whole political career in Congress for the last 9 years has harped against the high deficits and has said essentially what candidate Reagan said before he came to Washington. If you look at history, there are two periods of time in which high deficits are inflationary and drive up interest rates. In periods of recovery, you cannot have the high deficits. The administration's budget in 1983 and 84 does not assume recession, it assumes recovery. And I think high deficits at that time period is very bad. Secondly, when you have very tight money and you have a confluence of policies that has stimulated private demand for credit, very large federal deficits and very limited credit, that is a ready-made formula for driving up interest rates and thus increasing inflation. So I don't agree that deficits are not important. I think they're terribly important. They're important in real terms. They're important in psychological terms.
Well, if you had your way, Congressman, what would you do about the deficits? In other words, how would you close the gap?
Well, I think if I had my way, we would have passed what the Budget Committee recommended, which was to have tax cuts, but to relate tax cuts to spending cuts so that we didn't develop these huge deficits. Secondly, to go at spending cuts all across the budget. As Senator Gorton said, this year, the two largest items in the federal budget, entitlement programs, which are indexed, increased automatically, and military expenditures were not even touched. And all of the cuts were centered in the discretionary programs, which is the smallest part of the budget. And so I think very clearly we have to cut spending more. We have to put the entire budget on the, to share in the sacrifice and tighten its belt equally. And that means, well, for example, in military, David Stockman, the OMB director, in the Atlantic article said that as much as $30 billion a year is wasted in military expenditures, and yet he admitted that they didn't even look at waste and inefficiency in military. So further spending cuts and some ways to raise revenues.
What about those ways? What ways would you suggest?
Well, they fall into three broad categories. One, as Senator Gorton mentioned, the so-called loophole closings. Two...
I got a hunch that the two of you wouldn't agree on the loopholes. Maybe not, but go ahead.
We would have some agreement, but not totally.
All right.
You wouldn't expect that of the
No,
House.
would you? No, sir.
The second broad category is what would be what's known as consumption taxes. These are excise taxes on different commodities, for example. And the third category is to stretch out the personal tax cut that was passed this year, to stretch it out so that you reduce the impact of that revenue loss on deficits and in the results of high deficits.
In other words, just the opposite of what Secretary Ture just said.
Well, Secretary Ture indicated that this would be a tax increase, and I think to stretch out the tax cuts and to make them more responsible is not a tax increase, particularly if it has the effect of lowering inflation, because the biggest tax increase of all is inflation.
Are you enjoying being able to beat up on the Republicans on the...
No, I'm really not. At the beginning of this year, my main goal was to try to have a bipartisan approach to solving these economic problems. We were thwarted in that attempt by partisan confrontations. I think the country is lesser for it. I really hope that next year, as the problems get worse, that we will be able to work as Democrats and Republicans, and I think that's what the American people expect of us.
Thank you. Robin?
Mr. Secretary, we're going to come back in a moment to questions of taxes and budget cuts, but just on the economic assumptions, Congressman Jones just said next year when the problems get worse, Is it the administration's assumption that if you go into recovery in the spring or early summer, that these deficits are going to go down? For instance, if unemployment goes down, as the president indicated today, every percentage point of unemployment represents something like $25 billion in the deficit score column. Is your assumption that these deficit projections are going to go down if the economy recovers?
I'm not quite sure, Robin, what deficit projections you are alluding to.
The projections that I gave at the beginning.
Yes. Those are, I would remind you, very preliminary, to be sure. But I would say that the appropriate deficit projections, which the administration will produce in the budget document, will certainly take into account our anticipations of a strong recovery in the economy beginning in the spring or summer of 1982.
And will that tend to lower the kind of figures we've been using?
Oh, surely. It goes without saying. If in fact the economy does not recover as we anticipate, then the flow of revenues will be smaller and expenditures will certainly be larger than we anticipate.
Senator Gorton, would that help solve the problem for you if when the actual budget figures come out in a few weeks that, assuming recovery, the figures are a lot smaller?
The problem is that the figures that you placed on the screen at the beginning of the show already assume a relatively sharp recovery for next year. The figures we have received in the course of the last couple of days from the Congressional Budget Office show much larger deficits than the ones that you had here on the screen, and they also assume some recovery. These things have already been built in, and unless the recovery is much sharper than any significant economic predictions which I've seen, those budget deficits are conservative.
Congressman Jones, there are some predictions, for instance, the chairman of the Bank of America, that the way things are going in the recession, we could be into double-digit inflation. I wonder how your figures, the figures available to you, look, and do you think the deficits could be a lot larger than we're talking about, or that recovery might make them smaller?
I will not be at all surprised to see the deficits larger than those numbers that are coming out of the administration right now. And unfortunately, those deficits seem to continue well into the 1980s, into the latter part of the decade. As far as the effect of that, I think that it could very well send us back into double-digit inflation. What we're seeing right now is recession increasing, unemployment going to 9% and above early in 1982, and then as you naturally come out of that recession, unless the policies are changed, it appears you're going to go right back into a cycle of high interest rates and further inflation. And that's going to undermine real economic growth and capital investment.
Mr. Ture is shaking his head.
I don't think that's true either on the basis of the record or on the basis of theory either. Recovery involves an increase in the rate of expansion of total output. The more output you have with any given money stock, the lower the inflation rate will be. What the historical record shows is no connection whatever, Jim, between the rate of recovery and the inflation rate, nor with respect to interest rates. You made an observation a little earlier that you expect that with tight money, we're going to have an increase in interest rates. If by tight money you mean what I mean, that is a slow growth in the money stock, I would point out to you that it's only been since about the end of May or early June of this year that we've had a relatively slow rate of growth of the money stock, and it's in that period that we've had the beginning of a deceleration and a decline in interest rates.
Well, let me make these observations. First of all, the decline in the growth of the money supply has been decreasing steadily since 1978. There has been a greater decline, or very rapid decline, since mid-1981. In fact, it's almost been a halt. So, but if you look at the overall yearly averages, it has been on a moderate stance down. And the other point I would make, you talk about the historical record, all I'm comparing is what we have predicted this year versus what the administration advisors predicted this year, and we've been on target.
Well, now that we've resolved that, let's go to, Mr. Secretary, you heard both Senator Gorton and Congressman Jones say defense and entitlements have got to be cut. And the president says no way, right?
I would suggest that particularly at the present moment in time, this is not the appropriate time to be talking about cutting our defense programs. I think what is clearly called for is the greatest possible effort to make the increase in our defense preparations real. Now, I cannot, with any kind of authority, speak to the point of how many dollars of budget outlays are required in any particular year to do that. But I certainly don't think this is a point in time to say this is a place to time to cut a hole in our belt on it.
I don't believe that there's any significant body of opinion in Congress which wishes to cut defense expenditures. What we talk about in using that shorthand is to have the real increase at somewhat lower a rate than the President has requested. We probably had the largest real increase in defense expenditures this year that's ever taken place in peacetime. If we simply reduce that real increase above inflation from 7% in each of the next 2 years to 5% in each of the next 2 years, we will make a significant contribution toward the goals which we seek, and we will do something else. We will retain the public perception that we are dealing fairly with the budget and the support, the public support which is necessary for appropriate defense postures. One of the problems that we have right now is that the public does not perceive that the cuts have been sufficiently across the board and sufficiently fair to all elements of the society in order to be sustained over the long run.
I just wanted to put in perspective and agree with Senator Gorton, and that is that we are not calling for a cut in defense expenditures. I have long fought for a defense force second to none. But what we're saying is, when you look at the programs and you talk in terms of fairness, and you see the path that we're on, from 1981 to 1985, there will be real cuts in domestic programs of 15%. Using the administration's own budget in that same time period, there will be real increases in military expenditures by 40%. That is not perceived as fair.
We have about 15 seconds left, Mr. Secretary. I think you've already cleared this up, but I did want to come back to you. The President is not going to agree to delaying the across-the-board income tax cuts as suggested by Congressman Jones.
Indeed not.
And in that, I do agree with the President and the Secretary and not with Congressman Jones.
All right, thank you. Robin?
Senator Gorton, Congressman Jones, Secretary Ture, thank you for joining us this evening. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Tonight's edition of the MacNeil-Lehrer Report will be rebroadcast here on WETA tomorrow morning at 8:30. Jim Lehrer will return in just a moment with this week's edition of U.S. Chronicle coming up at 8 o'clock. Then at 8:30, see the lawmakers and sneak previews at 9. And here's a reminder that WETA will bring you a delayed broadcast of President Reagan's press conference tonight at 11:30.
For a transcript, send $2 to the MacNeil-Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10101. The MacNeil-Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. Funding for this program has been